Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you my tier list for 10.2 Season 3, the Amirjasil raid for healers. Of course, every healer is going to be able to be viable for cutting-edge progression, all of that stuff we know. I'm specifically going to make this tier list for the Race to World first as to what I think could be stacked, what I think is almost for sure going to be in the Race to World first, and then what's going to be a little bit more mid-level going into it. I will say healers feel decently balanced at the moment with a couple different strengths and weaknesses going into it. I'm a little surprised there hasn't been another wave of tuning, but we're going to talk about that some more as we break down our list. First and foremost, Holy Priest is the only healer I think that you could really stack in a raid. Disc might have a little asterisk about that, but we'll talk about that later. But Holy Priest bringing Symbol of Hope, even though it was nerfed to be 40 seconds of cooldown reduction instead of the 60 seconds, I think there's a number of later fights, particularly the back half of the raid, where having one symbol on hand is always going to be useful, and a second one also can be insanely helpful. Now keep in mind that a lot of raid cooldowns ended up getting nerfed, including symbol. The big area where defensives are getting nerfed is that cooldown reduction, whereas Barrier, Devotion Aura, Rewind, Ascendance, a whole bunch of other cooldowns, we're all getting their nerfs sort of directly. The biggest thing with an ability like Symbol is that it's giving you 40 seconds of cooldown reduction to a defensive ability, many of which are minute or minute and a half type defenses for players. And so often you're able to have everybody use their defensives at a key point in time, hit Symbol, and then the time passes before you need to use your defensive again, and you just have your defensives back. And with how bursty that the raid is, and often continues to be, as it seems like right now, there's a lot of rot effects in these raids, but they're not tuned very highly. And so if it's continuing to be large amounts of burst damage once again, then, it places even greater importance onto defensives once more. And Holy Priest is just good for that. It also is bringing you, of course, PI, which has been fantastic. Every raid tier, it's a lot of passive damage that gets brought to the table. And its output is sufficiently flexible to be able to help in whatever problem areas that you might have. There's a number of fights like on Tindral where you have lots of AoE healing required at the same moment that you need to drop prio healing into 2 or 3 targets as they're dealing with dot effects and trying to get out of the raid really fast. Holy Priest is able to contribute in this area. Whenever you're having the raid stacked, which is some of the most important fights, things like Smolderon, where half the raid will stack in a set location and need a lot of healing because they have these heal absorbs, Holy Priest is able to funnel healing into that group. Whenever you're having the raid getting split in half for fights like Volcaros, and we believe Nimue, if they haven't changed it, we'll see on Friday, Holy Priest is good for that. So there's a number of areas where their output is just flexible enough to be very valuable in the Race to World first, specifically for the mid and later bosses that we've been testing, because the early fights, can often be kind of whatever, that you are often killing with whatever comp you like. Next up, the slot that I believe is going to be in the Race to World first for sure, no problem, is Discipline. Shocker, right? Discipline could potentially, some people believe that this could be stacked. We had a long conversation on stream with a variety of healers making this tier list together, but everybody agrees Disc does way too much damage. It is currently destroying everybody around it in terms of its overall damage, doing 2 or 3 times as much as everybody else, and doing it, of course, while they heal. Now, originally, I was not too hype on how Disc's healing profile would perform in things like the Race to World first, or just sort of high-end healer content, because basically what you do is every 30 seconds, you'll hit your Mindbender, use double Radiance, and do damage. And you pretty much are bursting a lot of healing for 6-ish seconds or so, and then you have a cooldown period of 30 seconds of not really producing a whole lot, keep Atonement on tanks, and smiting to farm up your next Mindbender. While you can still have your heavier minute-and-a-half ramps, you're running with Mindbender, it looks like, with weaker Shadow Covenant and quicker bursts as a result, which works pretty well on some fights. In fact, on things like Tindral, it was really powerful by being able to always have a ramp for pretty much each of the root effects that the boss would do to you, so you can quickly push health pools up from the burst that's incoming, and then be able to sort of stabilize the raid from there. There's also a lot of stack fights, Tindral, again, as a good example, that where Barrier would be good, but even fights like going into Smolderon, if you're constantly having this large AoE damage going out from either soaking the orbs or from half the party taking really heavy damage from that heal absorb and the smash at the same time, there's a lot of value that Disc can have in ramping for those specific moments in time. And if they're adding a crazy amount of passive damage alongside it, that's just going to be really good. There's a potential, as always, of Disc being stacked if its damage is going to be this insanely high. However, I think they're going to tone down Disc's damage before the Race to World First actually happens, where it'll probably still be one of the highest damage dealing healers out there, but just not by such a gross margin. Next up, we have a Preservation Evoker. Preservation has been doing an absurd amount of damage and healing throughout a lot of testing, and while many of the fights, of course, are ridiculously heavy overheal, after getting to talk to some of the Preservation experts in UT and in Volk, the spec just cranks tons and tons of output, and it kind of needs to because it's not one of those DR healers that we've seen, the high utility healers that traditionally get brought to the race. It also does a really good job of being able to funnel large amounts of output into your allies through heavy Blossom builds, and when running with one of the supporting talents in Ancient Flame, where after you cast Blossom or Verdant Embrace, you reduce the cast time of your next Living Flame, you can alternate between Blossoms and Living Flame either for healing or for damage to be able to spot heal some allies or continue damaging the boss, contributing more damage to the raid, farming up more Essence Burst, so you can then funnel more free Emerald Blossoms along the way. So the spec continues to just pound large amounts of healing, and while Rewind did end up getting nerfed, it's still an extremely potent ability to be able to have on hand for things like the Race to World First, and just cranks crazy amounts of output. So Preservation Evoker, definitely believe we're going to be seeing some play from it for healers in the race. For Mistweaver Monk, this spec continues to be improving, and even though they've been making efforts to nerf Clouded Focus, the spec still continues to just hammer crazy amounts of output, and it seems to be a bit more flexible in terms of building up large bursts of healing. Even though they did receive nerfs to Enveloping Breath, it still seems like you're going to be on these sort of 1 minute timers with the spec, and you are casting an absurd amount of high value Vivifies to sort of cleave up the entire raid in terms of its overall healing, which is only going to be a good thing for when you need to just prioritize and crank huge amounts of output. And it also does a really good job of directing its output into the targets that are really going to need it the most. Now, notably, they nerfed down Clouded Focus, but they started buffing Vivify and Invigorating Mists, which is the cleave healing of your Vivify, which means that your spot healing, your support on those prio targets that we mentioned before, is only going to be improving. When you need to drop large amounts of healing into the adds on Laredar, for example, you have 3 trees you need to top off immediately so that they can charge up the seed in the middle of the room so you can clear the Room of Ash. Mistweaver's insane for that. When you need to actually heal up the Bramble Patch so that you have a safe zone, Mistweaver's insane for that. And you can also play more efficiently. Holy Priest is going to benefit greatly on that fight by just GSing it, and the faster that your raid is going to be able to prepare it and prepare it to be healed up by damaging it down, the easier it is to be able to take your time topping it off. But in a pinch, Mistweaver is able to hardcore dump healing into it and fully top it off in a flash, similar to what we saw at the Sun King Salvation fight. But even more so than that, their ability to just crank huge healing and survive. Really, that's one of the biggest things, and Preservation's the same way, of being an absolute tank really is going to benefit both of those healers, because they've had buffs for Bounce Back, which is one of the passive defenses for Mistweaver if they needed to spec into it. I know there's some competition in the class talent tree, but Diffuse, Dampen Harm, Access, as well as Expel Harm getting buffed, and then the passive healing out of Healing Elixir if it's needed, all present themselves as options to make Mistweaver extremely tanky in progression rating. And when you have a healer that you reliably know is not going to be dying and is going to just be an absolute live lord, that's going to be a huge benefit on hand for it. And while Mistweaver is not a really high damage healer, the way Preservation Evoker and Disc Priest look to be, they also do provide a reasonable amount of passive damage just by hitting Expel Harm all the time. Their Cocoon is incredibly strong, offering almost a near immunity effect, as we see on PTR with Mistweavers having cocoons of over 1 million. Pretty reasonable to assume that somebody's not going to die once they get Cocoon on them, and it actually feels really strong. This next tier on the list is kind of hard because it's not a spec that's feeling very strong, but is actually bringing good tools to the table. It's Holy Paladin, as they are operating for the Devo buff. While Holy Paladin doesn't feel particularly strong to those who I've been speaking to, they are probably almost certainly going to be brought into the Resto world first, primarily because of their ability to bring Devotion Aura and Aura Mastery in conjunction with it. These are just incredibly powerful tools of damage reduction passively to the raid, even though the way that Holy Pally stands right now, you have so many different small passive abilities kind of stacked on top of each other. You have the new Holy Reverberation, which is sort of a hot component that you're adding. You have Glimmer, you have the overflowing light of like Glimmer overheal, you have the passive judgment output, you have beacons, you have all these little passive things sort of stacked on top of each other, which also diminish the value of hitting Holy Shock to the point that the spec has received so many nerfs that it feels like when you're actually actively trying to heal somebody outside of a cooldown, you're not really like pushing the health bars up. And so it almost feels like Holy Paladin's not quite the spot healer, even though they're trying to primarily do the most output by hitting a single target spell in Holy Shock. There's a number of issues that Paladins as a whole are unhappy with, but it really sort of boils down to feeling like their spells aren't having enough direct impact on moving up the health bars. And while there's some fights like Smolderon they can burst incredibly well on through like the heal absorbs, and there's the benefit of like the Daybreak cooldown reduction and Daybreak haste benefit from the new tier set bonuses going into them, Paladins are not feeling particularly strong in the spells that they're casting, but are actually bringing a really strong toolkit into the mix of immunities, damage reduction, personal externals, all of those things that make it a very hard healer to replace in the Resto world first. And so naturally, the M+ nerfs are pushing Paladin into a worse feeling position as they go into a raid, and it only seeks to like frustrate them quite a bit further. There's also some potential concerns of mana and having to feel more restricted with your resources when, again, you're in this spot where you feel like you're almost having to like sit back and I guess use like infusions on flash or some weird things like that, which honestly just should not really exist. So I put Holy Paladin at this sort of Devo buff rank that they will get brought, but they may not feel great while being brought along. This next tier is more of cutting edge viable. These are healers I don't really expect to see much of in the Resto world first, and we'll talk about some potential reasons why you could see them. Starting it off, it would be Shaman, as Shaman bringing, of course, Spirit Link Totem. They've had their gameplay revamped somewhat from being like really heavy chain heal into like occasionally being able to cast it, but also there's the turreting playstyle of hitting like lots and lots of heal waves or playing around the occasional chain heals with trying to make sure that your burst output or your cloud burst totems are as effective as they possibly can. Shaman got pretty beat down with Guidance and Ascendance, Cloudburst nerfs, amongst others. A lot of them, from what I've talked to, have just been feeling kind of meh going into the next raid tier. It is nice that they have this option, or they have this potential of like really solid single target healing throughout the raid. And I think there is really high value for a healer that is primarily adding spot output, with pretty much everybody being in this position where they want to just be mashing their AoE spells as hard as they possibly can. There definitely is room for a healer out there to be just this single target health evener in the raid, and Shaman can do pretty well at that. Their mastery, of course, is not as valuable when health bars are yo-yoing from 20% to full in a heartbeat, because healers are able to top off health pools so quickly in general. But with the health explosion that we're going to be looking towards in 10.2, that might help a little bit. Spirit Link does have some good uses for fights like Laradar, or even fights like Smolderon, where there's a lot of health imbalances and inequality. That can help a lot in terms of like bringing it up into the raid. And while I'm not expecting to see a lot of shamans or much shaman in the Resto world first, I do think there is more than enough space for it in even like Hall of Fame guilds and all cutting edge guilds, just by skilled players who are enjoying the spec and who are passionate about it. And to round out our list is Resto Druid. From the Resto Druid experts I talked to many others who have been watching, Resto Druid looked to be one of the least favorably positioned healers, to the point that after talking to Torty and Vrokus, they've pretty much said Druid could be brought to the Resto world first if it's the only Druid, if it's bringing Mark of the Wild, which is kind of similar to what we saw out of Team Liquid. for the Aberrus Race to World First is they brought Xevi on Resto Druid / like Boomkin. In some fights he would play Boomkin, sometimes he would play Resto Druid, and he was there to make sure he was like bringing the Mark of the Wild buff to the team. I do agree. I think Druid is in this position where, yeah, they can like crank really large output with the revamp to their playstyle, which again, a lot of their druids were very unhappy with. They're no longer as bursty of healers as they used to be with some of the flourish nerfs. It's kind of similar to what's happened to like Preservation Evoker, where their like temporal anomaly echoes got nerfed down, their lifeline echo type ramps got really heavily brought down, and now they're in a position where they're kind of just spewing healing all the time. And Resto Druid being in a position leaning on their treants and not having as much focused output to be able to spew healing onto targets doesn't feel like it's bringing something especially unique to things like the Race to World First. For everything else, absolutely, it's going to be able to crank plenty of healing, but one of the big things that was pointed out to me was the fact that Nature's Vigil's healing converting into damage doesn't actually work off the treants that you're spawning, meaning there's a lot less passive damage that Druid is producing for really hardcore competitive environments where all those little things are going to count. When it comes to being able to heal or even assist with healing some of the ads that are coming up in Farak or in things like Laradar, they look to be doing pretty well in that regard. But compared to the others in terms of the Race to World First, they really look to be in a position where they're bringing Mark of the Wild, and then that's going to be kind of it. Having Roar competing with Time Spiral, competing with Speed Totem on hand, and still having the need for like Wind Fury groups kind of locks down that position for some of the speed increases that are coming around. And when you're not having the sort of like raid utility or damage reduction that you're seeing out of like Symbol, Spirit Link, Barrier, amongst Devo Aura as well, that's where it really starts hurting specs like Druid as you go into the race. I think specs like Mistweaver and Preservation Evoker can do well when they're adding lots of passive damage, when they're doing significantly larger amounts of healing to be able to outpace the lack of damage reduction, which has kind of been the world we've been living in Dragonflight, is that a lot of these pure output healers sort of live and die by their ability to out HPS the other healers that are bringing damage reduction. And Druid, while it can absolutely crank huge amounts of healing, is going to need something a little bit more than that for the Race to World First. Of course, all of these healers are viable. You can play all of these healers to great success, and honestly, you can beat a lot of other healer players, even if they're playing something that's being stacked in the Race to World First, just by outskilling them, okay? There's a ridiculous amount of skill expression in WoW and healing in general, so keep that in mind if you've made it this far in the video. And if you had, be sure to subscribe for more content, and be sure to check out our live stream at twitch.tv/AutomaticJak. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Let me know what y'all think about the tier list, and we'll see if there's any tuning changes after this that might change things up. Thanks so much for watching, guys.